What's Where on Earth? A British children's encyclopedia that is sold in bookstores around the world, or you can buy it on Amazon. One of the pages tells about a kind of Kievan Russia, a state that appeared in the 9th century on the territory of modern Russia. And this is in the 2023 edition, with the note completely revised and updated. Kievan Russia, not Rus. How many other textbooks, atlases and encyclopedias around the world have similar manipulations? How many children grow up with false ideas about history? This is a children's book. It could be ignored if the consequences of historical fakes were not so devastating.
Ukraine is not just a neighboring country for us. It is an integral part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space.
Hello guys, my name is Anna. I'm a cultural manager and also I'm a Ukrainian. And I'm not a professional vlogger, but I feel like YouTube lacks real-life stories from Ukraine.
I had never been a YouTuber and probably would not have become one if one day Russia had not attacked my country. I felt an urgent need to tell the world about us and our struggle. On the day I recorded my first video, 2 people were killed by shelling in my relatively safe city in western Ukraine. I started receiving thousands of comments with words of support and admiration for Ukraine, but I also received a lot of questions, both complex and basic, about Ukrainian history, politics and language. Anna, keep it simple, they asked, because for many people your country was just a problematic part of Greater Russia until yesterday. Some people did not believe until the last moment that Russia could start this large-scale war. Some people gave Ukraine 3 days because the second largest army in the world came to fight against us. Others expected Russians to rise up against this war and Putin's regime. Why did millions of people around the world make such a big mistake about Russia? A lie repeated 1,000 times becomes the truth. This is one of the main principles of propaganda. Kievan Russia in a children's encyclopedia is just a small echo of the big history game that Russia has been playing for centuries.
Many Russian history courses start with Kievan Rus, and they call it Kievan Russia. To this day, this is how Russian history is taught at universities. I'm talking mainly about Canada, where I live. People have not completely understood what Russia is. Because, looking at the way the history of Europe and Russia is taught, it's largely a pro-Russian narrative that's taught in schools and universities. So when Putin said, back in 2014, that Crimea had always been Russia, it resonated with many people.
This is a very common mistake that's made in the West when we talk about Russia, I wonder how many history courses in Western universities still have this narrative.
I am a lecturer in political linguistics. For 5 years, I was the vice director of Volodymyr National University. I understand the global impact of university education. This is a study by the Vox Ukraine project. It demonstrates that the share of courses on Russia in the Slavic departments of 13 major US universities remains disproportionately high in 2023. The analysis of these courses confirms that Russian greatness and unique culture are being implanted in students' minds through the spread of Moscow-centered narratives, such as Kievan Russia or the conflict in Ukraine, to avoid calling the war a war.
Ukraine, of course, has its own Ukrainian study centers. There are such centers in Harvard, in Toronto, Canada, the United States, France, Germany, but Russia has many times more. Russia is quite aggressive in pushing its history, culture, literature, and a lot of other things in its narrative.
The experts in this region in the West, they know Russia, they know the Russian language, they don't know Ukrainian history, they don't know Ukrainian language, they don't know any alternative perspective on this. So they accept whatever narrative they find in the Russian sources, in the Russian books. They'll spend a lot of time in Russia, absorbing the Russian narratives. And often it's done very uncritically, even unconsciously. And in fact, these narratives are very harmful. They are very partial. They're very biased. They are very manipulative. They exclude lots of things. They basically exclude a specific Ukrainian history.
Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, the capital of ancient Rus. You cannot understand what is wrong with modern Russian history unless briefly you go back to those times. Rus was one of the strongest states in medieval Europe. It flourished in the 10th and 11th centuries. 1,000 years ago, Kyiv Cathedral of St. Sophia already stood on this site. The first mention of Moscow will appear only 100 years later, in the 12th century. It was only in the 13th century that the Moscow Principality was formed. And what is important, it will be formed from the outside as a part of another civilization which determined its worldview, experts say.
For more than 200 years, they developed in the sphere of the Golden Horde. The political culture of Russian society was formed not just under the influence of the Golden Horde, but as a part of the Golden Horde. The combination of power and property is a characteristic feature of the Asian mode of production. For the European way, power and property are different things.
250 років, 2,5 століття, це була частина...
For 2.5 centuries, Russia was part of the Golden Horde. What do the Russians have left of the Horde political culture? Obviously, the vertical of power, some incredible cruelty in wars, and a genocidal way of seizing the surrounding territories.
At the end of the 15th century, the Golden Horde began to decline. Only then did the territories that remained outside its borders begin to look for their new identity.
Moscow princes remembered their connection with the Rurik family. Then the myth of monomachs had appeared. This is a very good case that illustrates Russian propaganda. In the 15th century, an artifact based on a Mongolian woman's head was created to prove the continuity of the Moscow Principality from the Rurik Empire.
This is a popular legend about how the Byzantine Emperor Constantine gave his grandson, Kievan Prince Volodymyr Monomach, a hat as a symbol of imperial power. In fact, it was a hat of one of the Tatar Khans, made much later than the Byzantine era. But it didn't matter anymore. With the help of this dubious artifact, the Moscow princes once convinced the world that they had the right to bear the title of Tsar. Ivan the Terrible became the first self-proclaimed Tsar in 1547. That's how the Moscow Principality emerged from deception.
I found a copy of a 17th century map created under Louis XIV. Why did I bring it? There is no Ukraine on it.
The Russian president and the head of the constitutional court are looking at the map from the 17th century to demonstrate that there is no Ukraine on it.
Якось вони погано дивилися, тому що це карти, власне, та 17.
They were looking at it wrong. This is a map from the 17th century, where there is a Cossack state, Ukraine. You have to be completely blind not to see it.
Росії там немає, тому що там
But there is no Russia there. There is Black Rus, which is Galicia, and the territory where Russia should have been is called Muscovy, the land of the Tsar of Moscow.
або землі царя Московського.
The Muscovy was the official name of Russia until the beginning of the 18th century. But as Russia expanded its territory and power, it began to claim more and more the history of enslaved peoples. In 1721, Peter the Great rebranded it, and the Tsardom of Moscow became the Russian Empire.
Перейменування Московського царства на Російську імперію
The renaming of the Muscovy to the Russian Empire provided historical continuity. Because what is Muscovy? It is a fragment of some kind of Great Rus. When a state receives the name of Rus or Russian state, it can begin its history from Kiev, from Rus, from Prince Volodymyr, and so on.
князя Володимира, Красне Солнышко.
This gives it an antiquity.
Це дає задавненість.
When Prince Volodymyr baptized Kievan Rus in 988, Moscow did not exist. How could it become the center of world orthodoxy?
Чому Путін ставить пам'ятник Володимиру?
Why is Putin erecting a monument to Prince Volodymyr of Kiev in Moscow? Not because the Kievan prince came to conquer Moscow. After all, Moscow did not exist in the time of Volodymyr. He's trying to bring out this mythical history of Russia as a history that begins with the times of Rus, that it is Moscow that is the center of Rus. This is a fictional story. It's a false history. It's a distorted history. But Russia cannot exist without it, because it was built on this fantasy and fiction.
Уважаемые друзья,
Dear friends, to revive our national consciousness, we need to connect historical epochs into a single whole. We need to return to the truth that Russia did not begin in 1917 or even in 1991, that we have a single and unbroken millennial history.
And this is how these historical manipulations are working in the international arena today. The French Catholic University is organizing a conference called France-Russia, 1,000 Years of History and Culture. The key figure of the event is Anna, the daughter of Kievan Prince Yaroslav the Wise. She was married to the French king and became the Queen of France. A Kievan princess who has never been a part of either Russian history or culture.
You know, there's no straightforward line from Kievan Rus to contemporary Russian, absolutely not. This very idea is part of an imperial narrative, is part of an imperial memory politics. But it is repeated as fact in many history books, in many university courses in the West, you know, that Kievan Rus is the ancient Russian state, when in fact nobody had heard of anything called Russia at that time, and they wouldn't hear about it for several hundred years, but still.
For centuries, Ukraine was enslaved by the Russian Empire. That's why the official version of history was written by court historians as the only possible version.
Russia
took chronicles from Kiev, from Pereyaslav, and from other Ukrainian territories. They brought them to the archives of St. Petersburg and Moscow. Many other documents were taken there as well. And it is clear that our old Rus chronicles were studied by Russian historians. They published and commented on these chronicles and added their own content.
Appropriating someone else's cultural and historical heritage is striking. The Russian authorities believe that historical Rus, Kievan Rus, should be synonymous with present-day Russia. This is a rule that students learn in Russian schools. Rus equals Russia. Wherever the lands of Rus once were, Russia has the right to that territory today. And now, for this project to be successful, the very idea of being Ukrainian, Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian language, and Ukrainian culture must be erased.
I live in Lutsk, a city in western Ukraine. My house is much closer to Berlin than it is to Moscow. But the streets of Lutsk, like in all Ukrainian cities, have been convincing us for decades that here is Russia. And it's not just the names. A block away from me, there is a house where Tsar Peter the Great of Moscow supposedly stayed. All residents of Lutsk know about this, although there is no historical evidence. There are dozens of such towns and houses in Ukraine. Tsar Peter certainly did not visit them all. So what is the point of all this? A historical trick of the empire to mark its vast space.
You know, one of its main features is the exclusion of Ukraine from the history of the region around Russia. You know, as though there were no states in Ukraine, that there were no political activity, that there was no culture, that there was no religious activity, when in fact all of those things existed in Ukraine, often for a couple of hundred years before they developed in Russia. But we don't know about that, because Russia became the empire, Russia gained the power and the means to spread its vision of itself.
Throughout the 20th century, the Russian Empire changed its names and formally its regimes of government. First, it became the Soviet Union, then the Russian Federation. In the 21st century, researchers are finally returning to the understanding of Russia as an empire.
This imperial identity requires keeping Ukraine within Russia's sphere of influence as a prerequisite. Putin directly speaks of Ukraine as the cradle of Russian statehood, spirituality, and identity.
I think it's not difficult to guess that behind me you see a monument from the communist time because of its style. And actually behind me you see an arc that was known as the Arc of Friendship between Peoples.
People from all over the world watch my videos about Ukraine. From time to time, I'm still asked, why did Ukrainians and Russian quarrel? Each time I try to explain that the unity of the Ukrainian and Russian peoples is an artificially invented myth, so that Moscow's claim to Kiev can have some logic.
One of the features of a modern nation is its common history. And Russia has begun to write these common histories. As early as the reign of Catherine the Great, court historians were hired to write down ideas. This is how the concepts of Great, Little, and White Russia emerged. A single great Russian people with 3 branches. And then it was included in various textbooks, maps, and official documents.
One of the derivatives of such myth is that Ukraine never existed at all.
Russian propaganda imposed on its citizens and everyone else the idea that there is no such separate country as Ukraine. It said that it was a part of Russia, that it was one people, that there is no separate Ukrainian language, but a dialect of Russian. This distorted history was not supported by any facts. But when you say it for a long time, most people start to believe you. Later, after the October Revolution, various quasi-state formations began to emerge, and the Soviet government created Soviet Ukraine. Before that, there was no Ukraine in the history of mankind.
According to one of Putin's latest versions, Ukraine was created by the Bolsheviks. In July 2021, the Russian president's website published a propaganda article about the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. Putin tries to substantiate the myth of a single nation and writes that Ukraine was artificially created in the Soviet Union.
From today, the parts of a united Ukraine that have been separated from each other for centuries are merging. The age-old dreams that the best sons of Ukraine lived and died for have come true. Today we have a united, independent Ukrainian People's Republic.
No, these are not the words that the Bolsheviks used to create Ukraine. And the creation of the Soviet Union was still 4 long years away. This is the text of the Universal, which in January 1918 proclaimed the independence of the Ukrainian People's Republic.
At the beginning of the 20th century, in 1917, Ukraine declared independence. And then there were 3 Russian-Ukrainian wars at once. Not only did Red Russia attack Ukraine 3 times, but the so-called Democratic Russia has also attacked Ukraine with its army. It was trying to conquer it.
Russians claimed Ukraine regardless of political use or the day in the calendar. Only in 1991, when it seemed that the Soviet Union was gone forever, there seemed to be a chance to forget about the empire forever.
After the collapse of the Soviet Union, no one managed to create a new national idea for Russia. Therefore, Russians have only an imperial identity, and it is only the imperial identity that holds this deeply atomized society together.
Propaganda has always been around, but in Russia and the Soviet Union in the 20th century, it was a kind of chief instrument of state power. And actually, millions of Soviet citizens more or less kind of believed what they were told by their government.
One state died, something different, great is being born in its place. The labors have already begun.
Most of the republics of the Soviet Union wanted independence and the collapse of the USSR. Only for Russia it was a loss of territory and influence.
Suddenly, there were fewer territories. The economy almost collapsed. And this great, glorious Russia became poor and corrupt, and no one regarded it anymore. And from such conditions begins a restoration. This is what Putin is doing. Ever since he came to power, we will restore the greatness of Russia.
A strong government and a strong hand to counteract the chaos of the 90s was demanded by the public. KGB officer Putin was a perfect fit.
I swear, there is a scheme about golden times. They were lost at some point, and now we are rebuilding them. This fits very well with Putin's historical policy. The golden times were the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire, and now Putin has come and is reviving these golden times. Russia is getting up from its knees, and other similar rhetoric.
Russia and its new dictator found each other and went back in time together.
Putin is a savior, like a god, the only person who holds this world together. This is a myth that relays and resemanticizes the myth of Stalin. At the same time, Putin the master came and restored the order. Modern repressions are justified by the fact that Stalin used to put everyone in jail, and it was okay, because it was the Soviet Union.
One of the reasons why the gulf between Russia and its Western neighbors is widening is because their history is moving in opposite directions. Russia is accelerating backwards into its past, and it's moving faster and faster into its historical comfort zone of repression at home, militarization, aggression abroad, and a society which is having more and more in common, not just with what we saw during Soviet times, but even during imperial times.
Modern Russian ideology combines the Tsarist double-headed eagle on the national emblem with the Soviet anthem, which they slightly rewrote. Russian propaganda has long made friends with orthodoxy and Stalin, communism and the White Guards, Nicholas II and the Bolsheviks who shot him.
The Russian propaganda machine is extremely eclectic. It often combines completely different ideas in its narratives and messages. Ideas that contradict each other, but they're used at the same time.
A Russian Orthodox priest consecrates a monument to Joseph Stalin. He finds the positive in Stalin's repressions.
And maybe we see that I, as a representative of our Russian Orthodox Church, we see that, to be honest, the Church suffered. But we have many new martyrs now to whom we pray and who help us in the revival of our homeland. I bless in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
63% of Russians share priest's opinion. If we can trust the data of Russian Levada Center, this is the number of people who have positive attitude towards Stalin. 10 years ago, there were half as many. Most modern Russians no longer consider Stalin a tyrant or a mass murderer, but an effective manager.
So we did all that.
Jason Stanley, an American professor at Yale University, is one of the leading contemporary scholars of colonialism and propaganda. Professor Stanley wrote the best-selling books How Fascism Works and How Propaganda Works.
Russia is frightened of the Ukrainians' spirit, democratic spirit. It's a serious threat to the fascist dictatorship of Vladimir Putin.
Professor Stanley worked in Kiev this summer. He says that Ukrainians are now perhaps the best in the world at understanding how Russian propaganda works. They have been subject to its influence for decades. The professor is convinced that today's Russia is more dangerous for Ukraine than the Soviet Union was.
Gorbachev is not Vladimir Putin. Brezhnev is not Vladimir Putin. You face Hitler. You face a genocidal fascist. Brezhnev was not going to kill every Ukrainian. Putin will.
When the world saw the terrible crimes of the Russians in Bucha, Mariupol, Izium, it was horrified by the true face of the Russia, the face of the executioner, which Ukrainians have known for a very long time. In 1933, the USSR starved almost 4 million Ukrainians to death. It was an artificial confiscation of food from the peasants with a clear political goal: to destroy the potential for resistance of the Ukrainian people. The Soviet government concealed and denied the crime. None of those involved were punished. Modern Russia continues to carefully conceal the truth about the Holodomor.
Taking into account the Ukrainian factor, the document should be selected in such a way as to prove the universal nature of the 1932 grain procurement, without describing naturalistic details, cannibalism. The document should be selected in such a way that the tragedy of the entire Soviet peasantry is visible, without focusing on Ukraine.
This is how Russian propaganda still recommends that historians work with documents about the famine in the Soviet Union, to hide the brutal truth about their crimes.
Russia supported foreign studies that were supposed to downplay the scale of the famine, to show that the famine was not only against Ukrainians but also in other regions. That is, they used various methods to prevent the world from knowing the truth about the Holodomor.
One of the traditional methods of propaganda is framing, showing only the part of historical events that is necessary and beneficial. It is used in Russia's biggest myth about the great victory in the Great Patriotic War.
This is a messianic myth. It says that in 1944 to 45, the Red Army liberated the world from the absolute evil of Nazism. Therefore, Russia, as the successor to the Soviet Union, has a moral mandate to demand a special position in Europe and a special voice in European security issues.
What year did World War II begin? In 41. In 1939.
There was no World War II in the history of Russia, and there is still not. When for the whole world it began on the 1st of September 1939, the USSR was preparing to divide Poland with Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union entered the Second World War on the 17th September 1939 on the side of Nazi Germany. Russian troops entered Poland and began fighting against the Polish army, which was fighting back against the Nazis. The territory of Poland was divided, and a joint parade of the Wehrmacht and Red Army was held on the 23rd September 1939. 2 years of friendship and cooperation between Hitler and Stalin are difficult to explain even for the most ardent propagandists.
I'll explain what the right is. When Hitler was destroying Poland, your country supplied Hitler with everything he wanted. Let me explain it to you. And then, when Hitler was destroying Polish Jews, you did nothing to save them. Have you said everything? No, not everything. Now get out of here before I throw you out.
It is so deeply embedded in people's understanding of that period of history because that was the accepted narrative for so long. Now, people may have realized that the Soviet Union only really entered the war in the form that it ended it in 1941 after its pact with Nazi Germany to carve up Europe between them fell apart.
It was only when most of Europe was already a continuous battlefield that Germany, according to the official version, attacked the Soviet Union very unexpectedly. In Russian historiography, the Great Patriotic War began only in 1941.
When did the Second World War begin? What? In the Soviet Union, it was unheroic to talk about the years 1939 to 1945. Soviet heroes were soldiers who fought in 1941 to 1945. There are cases where the graves of soldiers who died in 1939 are neglected and unkempt. And in the same cemetery, there are graves of those who died in 41 to 45, and there are also pompous monuments. The Soviet Union has very successfully forgotten 1939 to 1941. Everywhere, in every center of the village, near a council, there is a monument with 1941 to 1945 written on it.
Together with the cult of the Great Patriotic War, the myth is being created that the Russian people are the only victorious people.
I do not agree that if we had been divided, we would not have won the war. We would have won the war anyway, because we're a winning country.
For many people in the West, the Second World War was won by the Western Allies and Russia. And the Soviet Union and Russia, they make no separation between those two things. And that's why is that? That's because Russia itself deliberately blurs the differences between the concepts of Russia and the Soviet Union and presents itself as the victor in the Second World War, which allows itself to take this moral high ground, this kind of historical moral high ground as we liberated Europe from Nazism. So we have, some kind of legitimacy in contemporary geopolitical affairs.
Russia has a number of historical myths dating back to World War II. They called the post-war communist occupation of Eastern European nations liberation. National movements were branded as Nazi collaborators.
You are either a hero of the Red Army or you are on the side of evil. And it doesn't matter whether you are an SS officer, a Banderite, or a Forest brother, whether you are Lithuanian or Latvian. It's a very simple decision. You are either a hero or a traitor.
Propaganda uses past conflicts to represent, to shove people into boxes. So Russian propaganda represents Russia as the anti-fascist heroes that are fighting fascism. When Russia is a fascist country, Russia is a beautiful regime.
The propaganda myth of the great victory unites the Russian people perfectly. They are constantly looking for evidence of their greatness, but there is no such evidence, so they look for it in the past.
It's great for us to live in the world where our country is the coolest. I might not have money to buy underpants, I may be poor, I may have to go to the dump for a cracker, but I have greatness. Greatness that replaces other things in everyday life.
According to the same Levada, the number of Russians who consider their country great has doubled in the past 20 years, from 43% in 2002 to 80% today. But why? Has some economic miracle happened? Or maybe Russia has reached a high level of living comfort? No, this is just how Russian propaganda works.
Propaganda attempts, fascist propaganda in particular, attempts to swell the egos of people. It usually works in a society in which people have a tremendous amount of anxiety and fear. And so it tells them, instead of bread, we're going to give you national pride. You face a fascist regime. Fascism thrives off giving people nationalism rather than food, nationalism rather than life in this case, because Russians are being slaughtered en masse.
I would use the word indoctrination rather than propaganda. You just educate an entire society. We are like this, and we can do this. There are various cases of this throughout history, where a large part of society has this mindset.
In the last decade, the Russian language has become an indicator by which Russians have divided the world into their own and others. Anyone who speaks or simply understands Russian is proclaimed to be one of their own, whether they want to be or not. According to Russia, this allows them to interfere in the lives of other countries. The concept of the Russian world has become a justification for the wars of the Russian Federation.
This lingering idea that Moscow is the center of gravity for that whole region, not just for the former Russian Empire, but also for the countries around its periphery.
The Russian Orthodox Church plays a big role in the idea. It should be a kind of orthodox space based on Russian culture, Russian language, Russian orthodoxy, and Russian politics.
About the role of the Russian Orthodox Church, where it is still hard for some people who are accustomed to thinking of a church as a peaceful organization to conceptualize this as the ministry of state religion of the Russian Federation, which, like every other ministry, is being mobilized to actually achieve Russian state aims, including when they reach out to influence other countries.
God grant that everyone understands that there are no military threats or any other threats coming from the people of Russia.
The term Russian world was introduced into widespread political use by Vladimir Putin himself.
The Russian world is ancient Rus, the Moscow Kingdom, the Russian Empire, and the Soviet Union.
When in 2006, Putin gathered the so-called representatives of the Russian intelligentsia in St. Petersburg, he told them clearly, use the words Russian world more often, because the Russian world is not about borders. It isn't about physical borders. It is about those who love Russian culture and the Russian language. So, use this expression more often.
The Russian World Project has received hundreds of millions of dollars in official state funding. Its main official areas of work are to open Russian missions abroad and provide grants for the project that promote the Russian language and culture. In fact, Russian centers have been involved in espionage scandals in Europe almost every year. Back in 2016, the European Parliament classified Россотрудничество as a tool of Russian propaganda. The Russian World Foundation has established 104 active centers in 52 countries. Dozens of Russian World branches operated in Ukraine, preparing the ground for the first invasion and the so-called Novorossiya. Journalistic investigations proved that in 2014 it was organizations close to the Russian world that were the first to participate in anti-Ukrainian demonstrations in Donbass. And later they became centers where militants were recruited. Such centers continue to operate around the world. In the fall of 2023, Berlin will host the Russian Language Week.
Russian Week for the 15th time. Given the difficult political situation, this is a significant event.
Through its network of Russian houses, Россотрудничество, for example, organizes screenings of the propaganda film Opolchennochka. This is a movie made in Luhansk in 2019. It glorifies separatists and pro-Moscow militants. The film received distribution certificate in Russia, but was not released on wide screens. Even in 2023, the openly propagandistic film is still being shown around the world.
And how can I, and people like me, remain truly orthodox?
Through the promotion of the concept of the Russian world, Russia is still spreading the ideas of its greatness, alternative history, and its own logic of the world.
Dictator Putin wants to prove that your Western democracy, where every person has rights and freedoms, where every person has the right to determine how to live, where to live, what to do, where the authorities are not the masters of your life and the life of your country, but simply management. So Putin wants to say that your democracy has lost in this world.
This indoctrination of the Russian world justifies Russian crimes and programs new ones.
And who has always believed that Ukraine is a colony of Russia, a kind of lost province that he has to get back. And this is why we have to stop Russia in Ukraine, because if Russia eats Ukraine, devours Ukraine, it will keep going to Moldova, to Baltic states, maybe to Poland. Putin wants to create a kind of Russian empire, a sphere of influence stretching from Vladivostok to Warsaw to Berlin. That is his goal.
There is a lot of support not only for President Putin, but also for this terrible war. I thought about this a lot because I did not expect it. I had the impression that over the past 30 years, a generation of Russians had grown up who no longer have an imperial mindset, and I was deeply mistaken.
Russian propaganda is already working with new generations. Since the 1st of September 2023, Russian and, even more tragically, Ukrainian school children in the occupied territories have been studying with new textbooks. They contain a minimum of dates or facts. They contain a maximum of estimates and lies.
Ukraine is an ultra-nationalist state. Any dissent in Ukraine is severely persecuted.
The propaganda works. And Putin has used all of the resources of his huge state to brainwash his people to the point where what is a lie, they internalize in their heads and it becomes a kind of truth, a kind of psychological truth for them. And this is very difficult. They believe Ukrainians are extremists, are Nazis.
Russian children learn to hate Ukrainians. In this narrative, Ukrainians are dehumanized. They are instilled with disdain for the very idea of Ukrainian identity and admiration for the imperial greatness of Russia.
The main beneficiary of the Ukrainian conflict was the United States of America. They managed to impose their expensive gas on Europe. Propaganda should be simple. Uncle Sam has come and wants to destroy all the mines somewhere in Vorkuta. The damn Americans want to destroy us. It's binary thinking, friend or foe, good or bad, white or black, good or evil.
1.5 million 11th graders graduate from school every year with this knowledge.
Here they are, still warm. All of them are ready to be read and sent to schools across the country.
For many years, history has been used by the Putin regime as an offensive weapon, as an instrument of information warfare against the West and Russia's neighbors. But it is also a weapon against Russian society itself. I call what the regime does with history historical propaganda, because it is nothing like politics of memory or history politics as we understand it in the West, because of the scale of falsification of historical facts, distortion and manipulation.
The Kremlin is already cementing Russia's superiority over the world in official documents. Russia had previously been a principality, a kingdom, an empire, a union, a federation. Now, in the 2023 foreign policy concept, it is a separate civilization.
So, they are crystallizing this vision of who they are, that they are special, that they are a God-bearing nation, a separate civilization. This is actually a very serious claim.
The concept of foreign policy is a document by which a little controlled nuclear power defines its friends and enemies. And in it, Russia adds solidity to itself by relying on 1,000 years of experience of independent statehood, stolen from Rus, Kievan Russia. Do you remember?
The world underestimated Russian influence and Russian propaganda. And this, in particular, led to the terrible full-scale invasion.
Does the world have the right to be complacent again? It is naive to believe that the Russian-Ukrainian war will simply end and all the problems emanating from Russia will disappear.
Russia is making every effort to present itself as an intellectually developed nation. And behind the screen, it pursues its cruel, bloodthirsty policies, killing civilians, attacking and occupying other countries.
Why did the world make such a mistake about Russia? Of course, culture, literature, art and sport are never completely detached from politics. However, in Russia, culture has become a platform for propaganda long ago. People raised on democratic values find this hard to believe, and imperceptibly they fall into the net of the great Russian lie.